Welcome everybody, this is Manhaj. Welcome to my channel. In this video we will discuss the difference between class and objects and to understand what an object is. In the past video we discussed a lot about classes, so let's take a look at classes and understand objects. So we said that when we have a group of objects or group of things that they have common properties and methods, we classify or categorize or group them as a class. And then we name it a class of human, a class of animals, and or a class of products. So then if there are any differences between these objects, like animals, we have mammals, so then we create a subclass from that to apply the difference on objects, the difference between these objects on different categories. So the other part that sometimes as a student we get confused is what is an object and what is a class when we look at the same property and then we say that one is object and another is a class. So to make that easy, whenever we instantiate, we create an object from a class, then we give it a name. So for example, if we have an employee, like this is a person, so the class is called a person, and we want to create an employee from this person because a person is a human being, an employee is a human being, but we want to give it an identity, so each one is different. So to give it an identity, we will create an object which will be instantiated, or it will inherit, copy every property and behavior from the class, and we give it an identity. That's the point. We give it a name, and once we give it a name, that's an object which will carry all these properties and behaviors. So for example, I will say employee 1 will be John, and John is holding all these data. So now John has its own information: John, gender, male, age, all these things and all these behaviors. So now John becomes an independent object. It's an object that has its own algorithms and data structures, which is inherited or which is instantiated, or means that it's been created from a blueprint of a class or from a class. So how many classes we can create from this, sorry, how many objects we can create from this class? As many as we want, because this is just sitting there without any specific data. There is no data in it, but only properties and objects. When we create an object, that object will hold and will have its own values. So all these properties will be in a different state, like they will have name, gender, it will have values in it. So the data will be put into it, and that will make it an object, and it will have its own name or identity. So that becomes a different object versus a class. A class has its own, like we declare in a class all the properties and behaviors, but there's no data inside this one. We don't put value in it. We can have a static value, but that means that carries to an object, but itself it's a blueprint, so we get copies from it to create objects, more objects. One class, 100,000 objects from that one class. So that means that we have a class of human beings here, but we have so many objects running there. So it means that all of these sources have been born, or it's created from the same type of class, that they look identical to themselves. Like a child looks like their parent, but a child has a different name and different properties and different size, shape compared to parents. But the problem is when we translate this in code, the creation method is different. In a real world, things are born or created, made it from their parents and to child, so it's easier. We see like parents and then children, we can easily connect them, or we can have like uh, animals that are born from their pair animals, so they look the same, similar. So it's through a natural birth or other process of green products. So the thing is, when we look at something, it's easy, we know like how it's created, And when we translate that knowledge into coding, then that becomes a challenge, because when we write something, we create the object. So we have to instantiate the object. It does not just happen in a natural process, but the process, once you learn, it's natural to create a new object from a class. So let's move forward. We already talked about these a class, person, and then creating objects from that, which will have different properties. And take a look at these two photos, then you know, like, these are all human beings, one class, but different. Young, old, their property, attitude changes, their method changes, the way they stand, the way they talk, the way they behave. But if you define one of them, like, what is this? A human being. Legs, hands, speaks, ears, nose, the same thing. But it changes when we put the value in it. We would say like white skin, black skin, or blue skin, or like tan skin, like, or all the color changes. And the way they stand, like aside, more like professional, less professional, just relaxed, or old, and how an old person walks versus a young one walks. So these are all objects, but if we put them in one category, group them, it will be a person. All of them are person. Each individual person is an object because it's created from a class of its type. Okay, and let's move forward. I already talked about this one in last video, but we will see something in action in coding. And this one, so we have class, for example, person, that we will write code about it. We have a company that has both employee and customers. So it's probably a shopping center. So now we want to write code to build a website. So for that, we will create a person class, which will be the main class, because all of employee and customer are human beings, so they are people. But then we differentiate some of the things. Subclass, we create a subclass employee and subclass customer. So this will extend person. That means whatever is common in person, like name, behavior, we will carry to these two. But then we will differentiate. A customer is not getting paid by us, but they buy stuff from us. They don't, for example, work in our company. We don't need to have a timesheet for them. But an employee has a timesheet and they work for us, we pay them. So the difference. So we add these different extra things. For example, for an employee subclass, in addition to name, person, age, all these things, social security, address, we will add, for example, employee, paid, hours of work in our buildings. In customers, we would put, for example, all these things, name, properties, and then the address, social security, but we differentiate how many times he bought his stuff from our store, how many times he or she visits, and how far he or she lives, and what promotion we can give him. So two different things, two different methods, and extra properties are added into customer, which is different in database in our application versus employee who works and stays in the building, works and gets paid, and has a vacation, all these things. And customers doesn't have vacation from this employee side of the company. We can also mix, for example, a customer can be employee and can be an employee can be a customer, but that information is based on the table that you would duplicate or replicate to two different tables, but still you can connect them to one source. So in here we have all objects. For example, from sub employee class, we created objects. So we have name, person, age, social security, talks, walks, or gets paid, works 10 hours a week, works 5 hours a week. So then employee has the how much the salary he gets paid, and how many times per month, is it bi-weekly, weekly, or monthly. And then we create from this object. So now this object has all these information, like how many times he or she gets paid, and how many hours he or she works, and how is the salary, because now these objects will have different salary amount they get paid. They will work different amounts. So those things we will add into our code, that in each individual objects will have it, like In employee, we, for example, define that all employees get paid, all employees work 40 hours a week, for example. When we create instantiate this object, we say like, if job title is manager, salary is plus 200. If job title is clerk, salary just base salary, we have set up the minimum, for example, or whatever is the base salary. If a job if job title equals to position to technician, then we would say that works 70 hours and works on weekends. So all these conditions we will create on different these objects. We will give them identity. So its identity will be like John, the manager, Tom, the clerk, and Kim, the technician. So all of them will have its own identity. Now, since it's all the same properties, but the amount, the value is different in each object. So each object has different state of data. So when this is instantiated, its name is John. When this is instantiated, it's Tom. The salary for this person is 10% higher than the salary in this person, and this person works more than these two. So all of them, when we instantiate, create these objects, it will have its own. It's the same properties, but the values are different, or the data and the variables are different, and that's its own identity. So each individual object has its own identity now. It's the same thing to apply it on customers, so it will be a duplicate of talking about it. So you can now think about customer. How would you differentiate main customers with individual customer that has membership and does not have membership, and how many times is it regular, like buys stuff all the time, or comes once in a month, once in a year? So in this slide, I just copied this definition of object from this link. It's the same thing we talked about it, just it's good to have it in the screen. So to look at it in real world application, how it works, we would, from a class, we have created two objects where we have declared or instantiated two objects. Now each one has, all of them have the same properties and methods, the same thing, but the values are different. This is their identity. Each one has its own identity. Now object 1 is John, object 2 is Maria. So if you have, suppose, a web application, you want to look at the employee's name, you send the request that I want to see the employee's name. In backend, for example, you have the main method, you have the objects there because objects do communicate. For example, in main method, you say like employee.getName is, and it comes and checks in the server that is the server allowed or the application allowed to display the name. So it comes to the object and asks like, what is your name? So the object itself checks its algorithms, the instructions you have written for it. Are you allowed to show a name? Is there a method that says you can read the name? Is there a setter or getter, a getter to show the name? If property is private, so, and if there's no getter set for it, it would just deny it, and you can get null, or it's not available, or you get it rejects the request. So if it has a getter for the private method, then it says like, oh, there is a method, yeah, I have the name, here is the name, it gives it back to the server and displays it back what the name is. So what it means is that objects communicate with other objects, so we create relationship between them so they can communicate. For example, we set of rules that we don't set it in one object. One object will have all the data, then we have a validator that will hold all the validations. So before any communication happens to meet the first person to get the data from the third object, the first object will check if you have a valid request. If it is valid, then it sends it and see if the condition matches so what the object is based on or created on. So if it passes the validation, then it returns, gives you the value. So just have in mind that all objects communicate with each other, because everything in Java is class based. That means that everything you run is created as an object, and objects communicate with other objects. Who does it do it automatically? Depends if you have artificial intelligence or if you have some sort of logic that once my application is on and running, then just have these connections between these two objects. But it's you who will connect objects with one another. So you will have to put it in one package in one class and import, so they are connected. But objects do communicate, and as a user, you as a programmer, you will create that connection. Just remember that once you have an object, each object has its own identity, and it can communicate with other objects. Who creates that communication? You as a programmer create that.